Happy Mother's Day. It's a great day. I love Mother's Day. I love getting to celebrate moms and just all the women in our lives who mean so much to us. Because it's not just, having a child isn't the only thing that can make you a mother. Just the care and love that women give, like Adrian said. You can look around this room, and there's so many women in this room who love someone, care for someone, mentor someone, support someone like a mother. And so today is not just about the biological moms in the room. It's about every woman who cares and loves and supports. And so we're just so happy to be able to worship with you, celebrate you, moms. I pray that today you just feel loved, appreciated, supported, cared for. One thing that we do have for you guys, out in the back lobby, we obviously have the donuts, and when church is done, please take them all, okay? We don't need to leave any behind. It's not good for me, okay? Any that get left behind, it just ruins my diet. So please take extras, take them to friends, hand them out. I don't care what we do with them, but let's just make sure they're all gone. We also have pins on the back table in the back, these nice little pins. They have a little scripture verse on them. Those are our free gift to all the women in the room. So if you can just grab one of those before you leave this morning. You can go grab one now if you want to take notes during the sermon. We would love for you to do that. Today, I am intentionally gonna make sure this message speaks not just to moms, but to all of us. But we're gonna focus, we've begun a new series on the book of Esther, and this week I wanna focus on the character of Esther, the person of Esther. This woman that we got introduced to last week. We learned a lot of her history and the history of her people and her backstory. Today I wanna look at who Esther is. I wanna look at her story. And if you remember, I finished my sermon last week by saying this. I said, the book of Esther teaches us that how you start doesn't determine how you finish. Your start, no matter how good or bad it might be, and for Esther, it's very bad. The introduction that we get to Esther, the person, in chapters 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, she is compromising. She's hiding her religious and ethnic identity. She's entering into a relationship with a pagan, which was something that was completely forbidden for the Jewish people. She's basically compromising everything that she is to have a place in the kingdom. But we're going to see today that is not the Esther that we see through the rest of this story. Just because she doesn't start well doesn't mean she can't end well. And let me just say, as a parent, that is good news. I think that is good news to every parent, because I know, I'm sure the moms in the room know, and the dads in the room know, when you're parenting your kids, it can feel like you're playing catch-up a lot. It can feel like they're always a step ahead of you, and as soon as you figure them out, they go through this metamorphosis and become some new form of monster, okay? It's like they're this beautiful little angel baby, but they won't sleep. And so you spend the first 5 or 6 months of their life just trying to figure out, how do you sleep? How do you live with this thing in your life that cries at night and then sleeps in the car while you can't sleep? It's not good to sleep when you're driving the car. And then I think the lights, there we go. All of a sudden, you figure it out, you start to get into this rhythm, and everything changes. And all of a sudden, their sleep schedule gets messed up, or they start sleeping more, they start sleeping less. Well, then they become toddlers. They start moving. And it's a whole new experience. All of a sudden, you're baby-proofing everything. I remember our kids, we had drawers on our entertainment center. And when they figured out that they could open the drawers, they were just fascinated. But the drawers pulled themselves shut, and so they put their little fingers in there, and they'd pull shut. And every day, we'd watch our children drag their little fingers, and they never learn. It's like, come on, guys, you got to figure this out. And so it feels like a whole new adventure, and it's like you constantly feel, wherever you're at in your parenting journey, maybe your kids are teenagers. That's a whole nother thing. I haven't gotten there yet. But from everything I've heard, I don't want to get there anytime soon. It's hard to be a parent, and it can often feel like you're just managing. You're just scraping by. You're doing the best you can. And the story of Esther tells us that God can do a lot with people who are just scraping by. God can do a lot in our lives if we just keep fighting the fight every single day. If we keep showing up. And honestly, half the battle of being a good parent is just showing up every single day. And you might mess up, you might yell, you might, cry, you might lose the battle. But if you show up the next day, you can still win the war and be a great parent. And God can do great things in our lives. Esther, it's interesting. We talked about this last week. Esther is a book that never mentions God. There are no miracles in the book of Esther. There's no prayer in the book of Esther. There's no prophets. There's no prophecy. God is never named. And his title, no one even says the word Lord in the book of Esther. And so it's kind of a strange book for us to study and talk about, well, what's God want with our lives when he's not even mentioned in this book, but it's very intentional, because when you look at this story in its whole, and we're going to start to see the pieces falling into place this week, God's fingerprints are all over the story of Esther. He is at work in her life, in her cousin's life. He's at work in the life of the king. God is on every single page of this story. He's just behind the scenes. And often that's what our lives feel like. Often we go through life and it feels like God is distant. It feels like he's not there. It feels like we're praying for a miracle and we're going through motions and little things just happen in our lives and we're waiting for something huge. But the reality is God is in the little things. God is there and he's working and he's doing something in all the little coincidences and all the little moments of our lives. Today we're going to see how these random moments in Esther's life, from being chosen to be the new queen, in spite of her compromising, God is still going to use her. Her cousin is going to overhear a plot to kill the king, and he just so happens to know the queen who can let the king know. Coincidence after coincidence, moment after moment, that God perfectly lines up to give Esther an opportunity to save her entire people. If you remember last week, we talked about Queen Vashti and this queen who took this stand. The king was throwing this party to celebrate his wealth and his power and his greatness. And at the end of this 180-day party, he wants to bring out his queen and display her for all of his drunken friends. And the queen says no. That simple act loses her all of her position, all of her power, all of her status. She is kicked out of the kingdom because she took a stand and said no to a king. She said, I am more than just something to look at, something for men to stare at. I have more value than that. But then when we meet Esther, she's sort of the opposite. She's going along with the makeup and the primping and all this process, and she's going along and she's learning how to please the king, and she's trying to win this competition to be the new queen. And we kind of compare her to Vashti, and you think, okay, there's a strong, brave queen who stood up in the face of doom. And then Esther, who's compromising everything. And yet, like we said, that is not how she finishes. So as we look at the story of Esther, as we look at her life, we can see God working. The first thing that we can learn from the life of Esther is that there will come a time in all of our lives where we have to choose whose we are. Who are you and whose are you? There's this really interesting thing in the book of Esther. Esther is the only person who has two names in this story. She's introduced in two different ways. And so you see this happen in Esther 2, verse 7. It says, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. Esther is growing up in a society that is patriarchal, so men have all the power. Not only that, her parents have died. She's an orphan, and the only family, they're living in a foreign land, and the only family she has is an older cousin who takes her in and raises her as his own. But she's introduced with two names. And this is a pretty common practice. You can kind of think Saul and Paul, Simon, Peter. You would have your Jewish name, your kind of family name, that name that you were given at birth. But then you would have a name that fit the culture you were in. So when Simon and Peter, that time, they had a Roman name and a Jewish name. And Saul and Paul, kind of a similar thing. And Esther has her Jewish name, which is Hadassah, and her Persian name, which is Esther. Now, Hadassah means a myrtle tree. That's what her name means, okay? It's a symbol of peace and love, which is nice. Esther, her Persian name, means star. She's the star. And it feels like Esther begins to embrace that identity in herself at the beginning of the story. She embraces her Persian identity. She doesn't quite know who she is, and she begins to settle into, I'll be the star. I'll be the one that stands out. I'll be the one that everybody looks at. She's known for her beauty, and that's probably the only thing that people valued in her. But all of a sudden in this story, there's a plot to kill all the Jews. We're going to meet Mordecai, her cousin, and Haman next week. We're going to tell their story. But Haman and Mordecai are enemies. They don't like each other. And Haman decides that when Mordecai disrespects Haman by not bowing down to him, that it's not good enough to just kill Mordecai. He has to kill every Jew in the Persian Empire, which is about 15 million people. And there's an order that's sent out to every household in the Persian Empire, 127 provinces, that says in 12 months, neighbor, this goes out to every household, kill your Jewish neighbors and plunder their stuff. Everyone gets this notice. And there's actually a verse we'll look at next week. The city of Susa, where this is all happening, the people are perplexed. They don't understand what's going on. But the word is out, and because of one man's hatred, an entire people group is set to be wiped off the earth. And the only person, it seems, who can do anything is this woman who is now the queen, who has hidden her ethnic and religious identity. And so she's faced with a choice. Am I going to stand up and am I going to protect my people, or am I going to stay in the background and just keep playing the Persian game? You know, she has all the benefits of the castle. We talked about this last week. It's good to be in the castle. There's a lot of benefits when you're in a position of power, when you have privilege. And it can be easy to fall in love with that stuff. Fall in love with all those things. Fall in love with being the star. And yet here she is, and she's faced with the decision. Am I going to embrace my people? Am I going to stand up for them and risk my life? I mean, look what happened to the last queen who simply said no to the king. What's this king going to do when he finds out I've been lying to him? And he finds out not only have I been lying to him, but I'm lying to him and I'm a Jew who he just ordered to wipe off the face of the earth. She's faced with this really difficult decision where she has to decide who is she going to align with. And this is a decision we all have to face. Who are we? When we're in the kingdom, when we're in the castle, and listen, we are in the castle. We're all experiencing the goodness of the land. We all get that. There's privileges of just being where we are in this point in time. And the culture will want to shape us. It'll want to form us. It'll want us to become more and more like it. And we have to decide, do I want to give in to the ways of the world, or do I want to take a stand for who and what I believe in? And the question we have to ask is, who am I? Who am I? Am I Esther? Or am I Hadassah? Or am I something more? You know, when I was a kid, I got lost at Walmart. I was about 3 or 4, maybe. And my dad and me and my sister, we went to Walmart, and we must have been like the electronics section, because there was a video game system on the, you remember when they had those in the middle of the aisles? So me and my sister were playing the video games. My dad wanted to shop, and he goes, Aaron, watch your brother. I'm going to go get a few things, and I'll come back. Don't leave this place. And so I watch my dad walk down the aisle, and he turns and goes out of sight. And literally, I mean, I don't know if it actually happened like this. I was like 4. but it's a pretty vivid memory. I remember my sister turning to me and saying, "Go find Dad." And I'm like, "Okay." And I walk down to the end of the aisle, and I turn, and Dad's not there. And so I just start walking. And I end up in the back of Walmart. There were fish tanks in the back of Walmart back in the day, okay? This is I'm dating myself a little bit. And I'm staring at the fish tanks. I'm getting really scared. I can't find my dad. And the loudspeaker starts going off. They're like, "Evan, Imel, your dad is at the front. Please come to the front. We're waiting for you. If you see this boy, he's wearing a brown jacket." And they're like trying to get everybody's attention, find this lost kid at Walmart. And I remember there's this employee, and she's looking at me from like across the aisle, and you can tell she knows like I'm the lost kid. And she's eyeing me, and I'm kind of eyeing her, and I'm freaked out. I'm like having a panic attack. And she comes over to me, and she goes, "Are they talking about you?" I said, No. I don't talk to strangers, right? Like, no, don't talk to me, weird lady. And she goes, well, let's go find who you belong to. And so we start walking around the store, and we get to the front, and she points to my dad, and she goes, "Is that whose you are? Is that who you belong to? Is that your dad?" And right at that moment, I knew I was safe again. Right at that moment, I knew I was where I belonged. I knew I was safe because I knew whose I was. And as she pointed to all these other people as we're walking, "Is that your mom and dad?" "No." "Is that your mom and dad?" "No." When we finally saw them, I knew I was safe. And I knew everything would be okay because I knew where I belonged. I know who I belong to. And Esther is faced with this choice. Is she going to belong with her people? Is she going to belong and trust in the God that she always believed in, or is she going to go with the ways of the world? It's amazing that Esther has kind of failed so often in the story so far, and this is kind of her moment. Is she going to rise up? Is she going to represent her people? And that's the thing, is God doesn't call us to be perfect. He doesn't call us to have a perfect record. He calls us to belong. He calls us to be his children and to belong with him. I had somebody this morning ask me, can you ever do too much where God just gives up on you? Can you ever say yes to God so many times, then backslide, where he'll finally just say, "I'm done"? And I said, absolutely not. Because we're his kids and he's our Father. And as a parent, I can say to my kids, "Hey, you screwed up enough. I'm going to leave you to your own devices. I'm going to let you fail. I'm going to let you struggle. But if my kids ever come to me and need help, if they ever come to me and say, 'Dad, I'm sorry,' there's never an end to my love. It'll never stop. They'll always be welcome back home." And so that's the God that we serve, and that's the God that Esther turns to. The next thing we can kind of see in the book of Esther and her story is that we all like to make plans for our lives, but God's plans are always greater than ours. There's that saying, the best laid plans. You make these plans for your life, you make all these ideas for what your life's going to look like, and that's what we do as people. We all have some sort of idea, what is my life going to look like? Maybe when you were younger, it looked a lot more extravagant. Maybe right now it's like, I want to wake up tomorrow. But at some point, you probably had like a 10-year plan and a 20-year plan. I remember doing that in college. I'm like, I have no idea where I'm going to be in 10 years. I remember thinking about, like, what's my life going to look like? And I had this plan. We believe that we have control over our destiny. And if we can just keep our lives organized enough, if we can just keep ourselves focused enough, that we'll be able to get through it and we'll be able to be in control. But the reality is that even though careful planning is great and keeping yourself organized is awesome, wise decision-making can lead you on good paths. None of us are immune to the unforeseen circumstances that happen to us and that affect our lives. And our sense of control that we have can often be revealed by life circumstances to be an illusion. This actually happened to me yesterday. We were going out, me and my family were going out. We went out, we got in the driveway, we got the kids in the car, we buckled everybody up. My wife opened the garage, she goes and gets a bottle of water. We sit down in the car, and I turn the ignition, and nothing happens. So of course, knowing that it was just a fluke, I sit there and try and try and try and try, and the car will not start. All of a sudden, we had this whole plan for what our day was going to look like, and it was finished. There was no more plan. It was over. Now I had to stay home and wait for AAA to come and check the battery, which was just a battery, so thank God for that. But how quickly can the plan that we have laid out for our lives just be railroaded by circumstances? And in the book of Esther, a bunch of little moments and coincidences and circumstances that feel just like everyday things end up being God directing her path. And I just wonder what God might have been doing yesterday when my car wouldn't start. I mean, did he just protect my family from an accident? I mean, were we about to drive into something terrible? Or maybe it just so happened that the AAA guy came, and I'm talking to him, and he lives just a minute down the road from our building. He has he's a single dad with a young 11-year-old daughter. And so I got to talk to him about being a dad and how hard it is. And I said, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you could, being a single dad, it's hard enough with a partner, but to be alone. I got to invite him here, and I said, anytime you ever want to come by, come talk, come chat, come be a part of what we're doing here. It's just a minute down the road. Maybe that was what God had intended for me that day. Maybe I haven't even figured it out yet. Maybe God had much bigger plans, and this is all part of the way he's going to write his story and write my story. The book of Esther teaches us that every seemingly insignificant moment of our lives can be used by God, include not just the coincidences and the moments, but even the things that happen to us. You see, we can have things in our lives that are out of our control. There are bad things that will happen to you in your life that are completely out of your control. And listen, they are not part of God's plan. God did not create you and say, oh, I can't wait for that person to hurt you. I can't wait for that thing to happen to you. I can't wait for you to have that accident or get that news from the doctor that you're going to be sick. He didn't create you like that, but what he'll do is he'll take those works of evil, of living in a fallen world, and he'll turn them for good. And while the book of Esther doesn't point this out for us, it doesn't write out God was using all of these little things to bring about good, there is a story in the Bible that does. It's the book of Joseph. It's the story of Joseph. If you remember, Joseph's an Old Testament story in the book of Genesis, and he's one of 12 brothers, the youngest of 12. And he just so happens to be his dad's favorite. And let's be honest about it. He's a little bit obnoxious about it. Okay? Now, I don't think he deserves what he gets. Okay? But he's a little bit of a punk. And anybody who has younger siblings, you probably can identify. My sister would say I was a punk, okay? I was a little obnoxious sometimes. Joseph was a little obnoxious. He kind of liked to rub that he was the favorite in his brothers' faces. And apparently, he pushed them too far. And his brothers plotted to kill him. But they can't. They don't go through with it. They have mercy on him, and all they end up doing is selling him into a life of slavery in Egypt. See, they're good brothers. Just brotherly, just ribbing. They're just just playing in the backyard. They sell their brother into slavery. And so Joseph goes into Egypt, and he's living as a slave. And when we read this story, it feels like it's all happening rather quickly. But years go by, and Joseph slowly rises up in ranking as a slave, whatever that is. And he ends up in a place called Potiphar's house, this guy named Potiphar. And he's working in his house, and hey, it's good to be in the castle. I'd rather be a slave in a fancy house than a slave out in a field. And so at least he has that. He's got position now. And so he's working in Potiphar's house, but Potiphar's wife takes a liking to Joseph, again, out of his control. And he says no. He turns her down, and she falsely accuses him of sexual assault. And so he's thrown into prison. And again, it feels like everything's happening quick, but years go by where Joseph is wasting away in the dungeons of Egypt. But he remains faithful. He never stops believing that God is with him. And eventually, the king, the Pharaoh, sends his baker and his cupbearer into the dungeon. They did something wrong, and he sends them into the dungeon. And when they're there, they meet Joseph. He interprets their dreams for them, and they end up getting their positions back. One of them does, and the other one dies. And years go by. And these two men, they're back in the castle, but Joseph, or one man, is back in the castle, and Joseph's still in the dungeon. Years go by. And all of a sudden, the king has a bad dream, and he recounts his dream to his cupbearer, and his cupbearer says, you know what? There was a guy in the dungeon that interpreted my dreams, and it all came true. We should bring him up. So Joseph then interprets the king's dream. And then he rises to power, and by the end of the story, he is second in command over all of Egypt. And there's a famine in the land, and who shows up into his courts begging for food but his brothers? Joseph goes from slave to second in command over the Egyptian people, and now his brothers are here begging him for food. What would you do? All of these moments in his life have led to this. Here's what Joseph says to his brothers. After everything that happened to him, everything that they caused to happen in his life, he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You can copy and paste that sentence into the book of Esther and nothing changes. That's exactly what God is doing in her life. But this author is removing him from the story so that we can see that even when it's not obvious, even when you're in the dungeon like Joseph was, even when you're in the pit waiting for slavers to come and take you to Egypt, God is with you. He's still there. He's still working. You see, because when we read the story of Joseph, the answers are always there. We can always see what God is doing. In the book of Esther, we can't. It doesn't tell us, but he's still there. And in our lives, this is what he is doing. He is always working. He is always moving. Even in the most insignificant, even in the interruptions to our plans, he is working and moving. I talked to someone this week who said that they just recently had become a Christian, but they can look back at their life and see all these moments where God was bringing them to where they are now. They're in their 70s. And they said, I can see my entire life how God had been working even when I didn't believe, even when I didn't love him, even when I didn't recognize him, even when I didn't care about him, he still cared for me, and he brought me to this place. And that's the book of Esther. The final thing we learn about Esther is that when God has a plan for your life, when God wants to use you, you have a choice whether you join or not. As humans, we get to choose whether we want to be a part of God's plans or not. Esther chapter 4, 11 through 16 says this, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman, this is Esther speaking, who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So Esther's cousin wants her to go to the king and defend her people, speak on behalf of her people. And she says, you know, Mordecai, you know, if I go unsummoned into his presence, I face death. And there's this little line, I haven't been called for 30 days. This is a side note, but just because Esther's the queen does not mean the king is faithful. I promise you, in those 30 days, the king was not sleeping alone every night. You see, Esther, who was chosen to be the star and chosen above all the other women in the courts to be the queen, is now experiencing what everyone like her experiences. Everyone who sells out, everyone who compromises, the grass isn't always greener. Sometimes the castle will eat you alive. when you give in to the ways of the castle, when you give in to the ways that they do things, they'll just keep doing what they do, and they'll eat you alive. Esther now is experiencing rejection. She doesn't even get to see the king. She spent all this time, over a year, being prepared to be his wife, and now he doesn't even summon her to his bed. And now her cousin wants her to go and stand before him and risk her life to defend her people. It goes on in verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." You see, Mordecai looks at everything that's happened in her life and says, all of this, being taken from your home, being brought into the palace, being chosen as the queen, every single part of your story has led you to a moment where you have access to someone that no one else has access to. You have a position to take a stand, but you have to make the choice. And Mordecai shows a lot of wisdom here, because Mordecai knows God promised to protect his people. And he says to her, if you don't do it, somebody else will. God will figure out a way to save us. But you can choose to be a part of that. You could be the person that God uses to save his people, or you can continue to compromise. You can continue to conform to the culture around you and hope that maybe you'll escape. But the reality is you'll get found out, you too will perish, or you can take a stand. Who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? That is a question we can all say, that is a statement that we can all say to ourselves. What positions do you have where you have influence? Maybe moms with your children. There might not be a higher calling on earth than to be a mom. What if you've come to your position, your royal position, for such a time as this? Maybe in your jobs, maybe if you're a teacher and your students, maybe there's so many options, so many ways in which we have influence in someone's life. And what if that is where God wants you to speak up, to stand up, to take a stand for him? But the reality is we all have a choice. Esther could choose not to be a part of God's plan. Now, sometimes, like Jonah, God will not let you get away with saying no. Okay? Sometimes he'll send a big fish and swallow you up and spit you up on the shore of Nineveh. Okay? But we also see stories all throughout Scripture where people abandon their calling and God moves on and finds someone who will do what that person won't. King Saul, the first king of the Israelite people, abandons his calling. And so God chooses David. And Saul clings to power. He fights for power because it's good to live in the castle. But David has already been chosen. He's been anointed. And so as much as Saul tries to cling to power, God says, I'm done. You made your choice. You're not going to listen to my words. You're not going to do what I say. You're not going to follow me. Well, I'll bring about my plans through someone else. Imagine if Saul would have just listened to God. We would talk about him a lot different on Sundays. Imagine if Esther wouldn't. Imagine if Esther would have just continued to compromise here in this moment and say, at least I'm safe in the castle. At least I've got good food and servants and subjects. I mean, this is better than out there. But here's Esther's reply. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my attendants will fast as you do, and when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law." And listen to this: "And if I perish, I perish." Esther goes from a compromising, scared little girl to someone who's willing to stand before the king and say, if I die, I die. Because she understands who she is. She understands who her God is. She believes, just like the song we sang today, I am who you say I am. The world will tell us a lot of things about ourselves. Our culture will want us to believe a lot of things about ourselves. They want our soul. And they're fighting for it. Social media is fighting for kids' souls every single day. Media is fighting for your soul every single day. Politicians are fighting for your soul every single day. And if you identify with them, you compromise. Jesus says, you belong to me. You're not a Democrat or a Republican. You're a Christ follower. Don't identify with the donkey or the elephant. Identify with the lamb. I am the thing that gives you meaning and purpose and power in your life. And once you realize that, it can change your story like it changes Esther. She goes from compromised to a queen with power. She's this brave, beautiful, bold queen who says, if I die, I die. Esther stands in the gap for her people, and she becomes a Messiah figure. She becomes someone that points us to the one that we need, Jesus. You see, because Esther's about to stand in the gap for a bunch of people who will die someday anyway. Okay? Every Jew that she puts her life on the line for will eventually die. Every single person that she stands in the gap for and risks her life by going to the king will someday taste death. We still needed something greater than Esther. We still needed something greater than David or Joseph or any of these other biblical characters, Moses, Noah. There was always a pointer to something more. And you see, Jesus, when he stood at the face of death, when he stood in the gap for us, he said, when I perish, I'll perish. But that won't be the end. You see, Jesus wasn't risking. He knew exactly what he was doing. Jesus stood against the castle. He stood against the authority. It's so interesting that in the story of Jesus' death, he's shipped around to all these different places. The Sanhedrin accuses him. And then Pilate, who represents Rome, accuses him. And then he goes to Herod, who represents the Jews, and he accuses him. He goes place to place to place. All the powers of this world find Jesus. They all have a chance to save him. They all have a chance to spare him, and none of them do. Because he stands against the powers of this world and says, if I die, I die. But when he died, he took our place. He not only was Esther, he was more than Esther. He took the stand for us. And now, when he says who we are, he says, you have been chosen and accepted and loved, and I have redeemed you. The story of Esther illustrates that courage and faith are not incompatible with fear and hesitation. I love that Esther is not a superhero in this story. I love that she doesn't get everything right, because that's our existence. We don't get everything right. Our stories are filled with mistakes and backsliding and failures and flaws and compromises. And if we let those things define us, there's no way we would ever take a stand like Esther does. But if we continue to believe I am who God says I am, I belong to him, I am his, then we'll always believe that it's not me that defines me, it's what he says about me that defines me. I am loved, I am chosen, I'm accepted. I matter. And when you believe that, you can rise to the occasion and be a part of God's plan. This morning, we're going to bring the band back up and we're going to continue worshiping and take an opportunity to just focus our hearts and minds on what Jesus has done for us. In the same way that Esther stood in the gap for her people, Jesus stood in the gap for us against sin and death. And he took our place. He took our penalty. He took what we deserved onto himself. And then he rose again so that death and sin could never have a claim on us anymore. They don't get to define who we are. We are only defined by him. So let's stand together and let's worship this morning.